21st by Elena Lopez on ancient artifacts in court, how the case of Rubin versus Iran could affect museums. I think it would be very important for you to come along to that. She was one of the attorneys representing Iran in this lawsuit. Then following that, we have Salam al-Kumtar, who is here today. She will be speaking on March 13th for Syrian cultural heritage and the crossfire, past, present, and continuity. And obviously this is in the news as I stand here. So I think this, again, these are both very important issues in talks that I recommend that you come to. The schedule is in the back on your way out if you want to pick it up. Before I begin, I just want to mention that the lecture series is supported and sponsored by the Pogo Foundation, and they have supported us over the last several years, and we appreciate that help. Today, the talk is by Laurent Dissard. It was entitled Contested Heritage, Archaeology Museums in Turkey. And this is really about the future of representation of culture in Turkey and how this has been planned and thought through over the past several years, and how museums are going to play a role in that. And I think this again emphasizes how important museums are in the representation of culture and the representation of heritage throughout the world. And I think Turkey's attempt to go around the world and identify objects in museums to get them back, to request them back, or demand them back, is very much part of this package. Let me just mention that Laurent is currently an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Penn Humanities Forum here at the University of Pennsylvania. He teaches a seminar entitled Turkey, Past and Present in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He received his PhD just last year in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, with a dissertation on the history of the Keban Dam Rescue Project in Eastern Turkey. And he is currently writing a book manuscript entitled Submerged Stories in Eastern Turkey, which deals with the politics of archaeology in Eastern Turkey. So let me turn it over to Laurent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Brian and Sasha, for organizing this talk, and thank you to the Penn Cultural Heritage Center for inviting me to share a little bit of my research on the politics of the past in Turkey, with today's special focus on museums. And this is, I envision this talk as the second part of a talk I gave in the classics department a few weeks ago, entitled The Cultural Afterlife of Mosaics. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to focus on museums. First of all, give you a brief history of museums starting in the late Ottoman period, with the first imperial museums established in Istanbul, going through the Republican period with museums in Ankara, trying to define a new nation, and finally making it through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and looking at some of new museums, privately funded museums in Istanbul. In the second part of my talk, I'm leaving the history of museums behind and looking at three specific case studies in southeastern Turkey, in the cities of Gaziantep, Diyarbakir, and Urfa, in order to give you some examples of how different museums in these cities redefine the local identities. So before I get started, I want to say that there has never been a national museum in Turkey. Instead, different museums are established and define the Turkish nation in different ways throughout the country. Having said this, I want to start my talk with the late Ottoman period and the first Ottoman museums that have their origin in military collections. So the Church of Aya Irene, which means peace, was used in the 1840s to display military objects. There was no focus in these museums, in these early museums, on art, science, or history like other imperial museums in Europe. There was no ambition at encyclopedic knowledge popular in museums of the European Enlightenment. Instead, at their birth, museums in the Ottoman period were military museums. The Ottoman Imperial Museum in the middle of the 19th century begins to display archaeological objects, but these objects have no specific order. They're ancient inscriptions and sculptures that are brought by local Ottoman administrators across the empire to Istanbul. This is not an interest in art history, in the evolution of art in the Ottoman territories. Rather, it's these objects are placed in a museum in order to protect them against European travelers, collectors, and archaeologists who, during the 19th century, are going throughout the Ottoman territory, excavating objects and bringing them back to European imperial museums. In 1869, the Ottoman Imperial Museum is reorganized, and this is a first shift from a military museum to expressing some kind of a cultural or national identity. This identity is defined as a resistance against European imperial practices of collecting antiquities. And it's part, the establishment of the Ottoman Imperial Museum is part of a larger move by the Ottoman Empire to modernize and westernize. It is also tying its Ottoman identity to a shared European cultural heritage. But it adopts the European model of a museum to assert its territorial integrity against Europe. And this is one of the first paradox that I want to raise in this talk, is that many of these institutions at the end of the Ottoman period helped to define an Ottoman collective identity against European nations encroaching upon their territories. The Ottoman Imperial Museum is renamed the Istanbul Archaeology Museum after 1920, and it's still open today in Istanbul. Moving on to the early Republican era, so post-1923, after the foundation of the Turkish Republic, there's an attempt by the state to support national theaters, national orchestra, national ballet, as well as national museums. Museums at this time become the secular temple of the Republic. For instance, the Tomb of Rumi, 13th century Sufi poet in Konya, a holy site, becomes the more secular Konya Museum of Antiquities in 1927, a statement made by the state against the powerful religious brotherhoods. Hagia Sophia, similarly, also becomes a museum in 1935, which emphasizes more its architectural history rather than its religious use over the centuries. And by transforming Hagia Sophia into a museum, it shows how both Byzantine and Ottoman empires are dead. So there's also a shift at the same time after 1923 to ethnically based national identity in two new museums in Ankara, the Ethnography Museum and the Archaeology Museum. The first museum in Ankara in 1930 is the Ethnography Museum. And this, again, is not a museum of art, science, or history, but instead it puts the genius of the Anatolian people forward. So in this Ethnography Museum are objects of everyday life, such as carpets and costumes, old carpentry or metalwork, ancient calligraphy, manuscripts, old Qurans are also exhibited. Works of everyday use by and for the people, collected from all regions across Turkey. This can be seen as an attempt to preserve the culture of Anatolian people that is quickly vanishing due to the modernization process. Contemporary Turkey at this time tries, through its museums, to distance itself from its past, seeing it as foreign. It historicizes objects in these cities, in these new museums, which are the products of this modernity. At the same time, we have to remember that these everyday practices are actually still very common in Turkey at the time. But the archaic practices need to be replaced by modern ones, modern practices such as museum. Another important thing that this ethnography museum, as early as the 1930s, does is divide the country into geographic regions. There's, at this time, an ideological shift from defining the nation as a sum of its regions. This is done to eliminate the idea of a nation and the millet system under the Ottoman Empire, which saw itself as united around its religious and ethnic differences. So, through this ethnography museum, Turkish identity is now redefined geographically, moving away from religious and ethnic and linguistic differences to more geographic and regional differences. A second museum built at the time after the founding of the Turkish Republic is the Hittite Museum, which is later reorganized in 1968 as the Anatolian Civilization. And in this museum, as you walk through the museum, you follow the different ancient Anatolian cultures from prehistory to antiquity. And like the ethnographic museum, the museum maps different cultures across different regions, ancient cultures. It emphasizes the independence and the regional cultures of ancient times, the sum of which, if we take all of these cultures, all of these Anatolian cultures together, defines Anatolian civilization. And interestingly, Anatolian civilization overlaps very nicely with the modern Turkish territory. It's a cohesive archaeological narrative of Anatolia, which again underplays ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity. It emphasizes both Anatolia as a cradle of civilization in the European model, as well as the cradle of modern Turkey. The third period I want to talk about begins in the 1960s, and this is where the model of museums established in Ankara, both ethnographic and archaeological museums, spreads throughout the rest of Turkey. So this model, ethnography and archaeology, is standardized and replicated in museums throughout the country, beginning in the 1960s. Ankara's two separate institutions become the model for one museum in every city. Regional museums usually combine an ethnographic section on the top floor and an archaeological section on the bottom floor. Through these local museums, the regional variations of the Anatolian civilizations is thus reinforced. The central national archaeological and historical narrative in Ankara imposes itself throughout the country. These new museums that are built in the 1960s are not pretty to look at from the outside. There's some examples here from Konya, Kayseri, and Urfa. They're not. I would argue that they're not a great success because at this time Turkey really has other things to worry about. The period between 1961 and 1983 corresponds to 3 military coups. It's a country that has a weak economy and that knows in the 60s and 70s a lot of political instability. So the museums that are built at the time, I would say, reflect this political economic instability. At the same time, however, in Turkey, with the rise of tourism, the museums that are really taking shape more nicely are museums that are placed on archaeological sites, done to attract tourists and that receive more money because of the rise in tourism at the time. So, fourth period, the current era, starting in the 1980s, and the economic liberalization pushed forward by the government, which brings the privatization of museums in Turkey. The government, after the military coup in the 80s, begins a neoliberal economic program which brings wealth and power to both banks and a few families. These families, behind large corporations, are going to invest in private museums and art institutions. So, for example, the Koç family will open as early as 1980 the Sadberk Hanım Museum. Later on, a museum devoted to industry, the Rami Koç Museum, and also helps to launch with the Kirac family the Pera Museum in Beyoğlu, in Istanbul. The Profilo Corporation also funds, in 2002, the opening of a museum of Turkish Jews. This is important to keep in mind because in Turkey it is the only museum that celebrates the role of a minority group within the Turkish nation. The Sabancı and the Eczacıbaşı family also opened their art museum. This is the Sakıp Sabancı Museum on top, opened in 2002, which is an art museum, and the Istanbul Modern opened in 2004, also a contemporary art museum. And banks also, such as Yapı Kredi, Akbank, Garanti Bank, also starting in the 1990s, opened their art centers. And so these museums that are open, many of them are Fine Arts Museum, which is a first in Turkey. Turkey, before the 1980s, had Archaeology Museum, had Military Museum. It didn't have contemporary art museums. These museums, most of them in Istanbul, appeal to a secular and urban elite, and which a part of the Turkish population that follows European cultural norms of museum visit, for example. In parallel to these private museums, during the same era, these private museums which appeal to the secular urban elites, the AK Party, the conservative Islamist party in power since the late 90s in Istanbul, for example, also becomes interested in museums. And the museums that they focus on tend to emphasize Turkey's Islamic heritage. So, for example, these are all open in the year 2008, 5 years ago. The Islamic Sciences and Technology History Museum in Gülhane Park is open. Inside the Topkapı Palace, the rooms of the Mental of the Prophet are renovated in 2008, as well as just outside the Istanbul city walls, the 1453 Panorama Museum, which focuses on the Ottoman conquest of Istanbul, is open that same year. So these new museums, which are directly funded by the Istanbul municipality or by AK Party, are contextualized Turkish culture within the larger pan-Islamic framework. And but the bigger project is going to be open in 2023. This is AK Party's larger project of opening the world's largest museum. The world's largest museum in 2023 in Ankara to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Republic. And this museum is part of a larger vision of AK Party and of the government that aims for 2023 to place Turkey among the top 10 world economies, to reduce unemployment rate below 5%, to have 3 operating nuclear power plants, to achieve full European Union membership, and to include everyone in the health insurance system. There are many other goals. I'm just citing the most interesting ones. And in addition to that, it aims by 2023 to make Turkey the 5th largest tourist destination in the world, as well as build the largest museum in the world in Ankara. So, while we wait for the largest museum in the world to be built, let's now go to southeastern Turkey and visit a few of the new state-of-the-art archaeology museums that are being built in that region. And I was looking for a map to show you of Turkey when I came across this one, which is from a pamphlet called the Tourism Strategy of Turkey for 2023, published by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. So the region that we're going to is southeastern Turkey, which here in this master plan of culture for 2023 is called the Faith Corridor. And the cities that we'll be visiting are Gaziantep here, Şanlıurfa, and somewhere here, erased from the map, Diyarbakır. So Gaziantep, first of all, recently opened the country's largest Mosaic Museum. And inside this museum, it houses many of the Roman mosaics unearthed at the nearby site of Zeugma. In 19th century, the site of Zeugma was already known to European travelers and collectors. The looting of Zeugma, however, reaches its highest peak in the 1960s, when mosaics began to appear on the antiquities market, often labeled as Eastern Mediterranean or Eastern Turkey or near Syria. In response to this illegal smuggling, excavations began by the Gaziantep Museum in the 1980s, but these excavations, however, do not stop the illegal digging. In July 1992, for instance, local guards find a large tunnel on the site which reaches a villa and a well-preserved Dionysus and Ariadne mosaic. Despite the tunnel that was built, the decision was to preserve and guard the mosaic on site. 6 years later, however, on the night of June 15th, the looters, maybe the same ones that dug the tunnel, come back and are able to remove 2/3 of the mosaic. The mosaic was displayed with a question mark in the Gaziantep Museum for a while. It is now displayed with an image projecting the missing parts of the mosaic. Later in the 1990s, rescue excavations began at Zeugma before the construction of the Birecik Dam, which, when it was finished in 2000, submerged parts of the site of Zeugma. These rescue excavations were sponsored by the Hewlett-Packard Humanities Foundation, and the mosaics were first transported to Gaziantep's Archaeology Museum, a museum built in the 1960s. They were finally moved last year to the new Mosaic Museum, which I showed a picture of. Another mosaic unearthed in 1993 by this rescue team, by an Australian team, was also found partly looted. The mosaic was discovered with 2 figures missing from their knees up. It was removed and smuggled out of Turkey in 1965. And the best picture here is where you see how looters have taken the 2 figures out. Part, not the whole floor, but just part, the pretty parts of the mosaic. This mosaic was also displayed with a question mark in the Gaziantep Museum for a while, in order to alert visitors to the consequences of looting. In the 1990s, however, the missing fragment were found in a private collection in Houston and brought back in a wooden box with a Turkish flag. The now Parthenope and Metiokos have been reunited and are displayed, as you can see here, in the Gaziantep Mosaic Museum. So besides these mosaics that are displayed with a question mark to alert the visitors of the consequences of looting, and besides some attempts that made to place the mosaic inside the reconstructed Roman houses, this is a picture of a mosaic displayed as a floor in a reconstructed house with the original fresco also displayed on the walls. Mosaics in the Gaziantep Museum are generally displayed as art objects. there's not much description of the social history of the city of Zeugma. Sometimes mosaics can be seen hanging on walls, like paintings, and not floors. They're taken out of their context because it is their aesthetic qualities that are to be admired. Inside the museum, there's a film that is shown which gives more background to the rescue excavations. This film celebrates the heroic work of the archaeologists and the restorers. However, it does not emphasize any of the controversy associated with them building in Eastern Turkey. And so, again, like other museums across Turkey, the illustrious past of ancient Anatolia legitimizes the technologically advanced but contested modern state of Turkey. We now move from the city of Gaziantep. We continue the faith corridor, our trip on the faith corridor, and spend some time in Urfa. Urfa, at the end of the Ottoman period, was a relatively large town, population 50,000. Its wealth was derived from the large bazaar in the center of the city, as well as the rich agricultural lands in the surrounding region. The city was multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, like many Ottoman cities across the territories. There was a thriving Muslim, Turkish, Arabic, Kurdish-speaking population, which made up 60% of the city, as well as important Armenian, Syriac, and Jewish communities, which made up 40% of the city. Many of the leading merchants, artisans, craftsmen, architects, and masons of the city belonged to these communities. And in fact, the largest landowners outside of Urfa, in the Harran Plain, for example, were also Armenian, Syriac, and Jewish. However, at the end of the 19th century, drastic changes in the city takes place. Starting in 1895, a series of pogroms against the Christian minorities, and in 1915, the deportation law of the Committee for Union and Progress, which is aimed at deporting mainly Armenian families. During this end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, many Christian and Jewish families are expelled out of Urfa when not massacred. Their lands, their goods, their houses, their capital are left behind and are transferred to local tribal leaders. And at this time, many of the city's large stone houses are destroyed or abandoned. These stone houses, which in their majority are built by the Syriac masons. Some of these houses are given to the tribal Kurdish and Turkish leaders, which are going to constitute a new elite of the city. After this period, the city goes through an economic and demographic decline. Only 3,000 Christians returned to Urfa during the Republican period. And by 1948, the Jewish families of Urfa had all migrated to Israel. The last Armenian in Urfa, a medical doctor, is said to have died in 1970. The new ruling class in Urfa emerges at this time, at the beginning of the Turkish Republic. And it is made up of large Turkish and Kurdish Muslim tribal families. The municipality of Urfa aligns itself for the support of these leading families. And these leading families in Urfa, these sometimes called tribes, ashiret, are own not just businesses, but the local newspapers and the local television stations as well. So how does a city like Urfa deal with such a difficult history and such a contested heritage? The Shurkav, which is the Foundation for Culture and Research in Urfa, opened in the late 1980s was opened by the municipality in the late 1980s. Its goal was to preserve the city's cultural heritage. And it was opened in the 80s in response to the damages caused by rapid urban migration from nearby villages to the old town. with Shirkav, some of the buildings of Urfa are restored. Some of them are open as hotels and restaurants. Shirkav also publishes books on the city's architectural history. One example of these restoration work is the Cihad Konuke. It's the foundation's first project. And it begins restoring this house in 1991 with the financial help from the former governor of the province. It opens as a guest house in the 1990s with its website, which presents the house as built according to traditional Urfa housing. It also emphasizes that there are two different parts in the house, one for men, one for women. So this might this might go by when you're reading the website, but actually the fact that it's placed there, that it's emphasizing the fact that the house was divided, will be understood by some as being a Muslim house, which is true or not, I don't know. Whether you explain that, which is true or not, whether Muslim houses had more of a gender division than Christian or Jewish houses. Probably in Urfa in the 19th century, whether you were Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, you followed similar gender divisions in the house. However, there's an Armenian inscription which identifies the house owner as Afadi, an Armenian name. In addition, the house is located opposite Urfa's largest Armenian church. This Armenian church, the Church of St. John the Baptist, is located in Urfa's old Armenian quarters. It was built in the 19th century on the ruins of an old 5th century church, but abandoned after 1915 and temporarily used as a power station. The cemetery around the church was leveled in the 1920s to make place for the street that bypasses the old town. And in 1993, Shirkav restores the church and reopens it as the Mosque of Selahaddin Eyyubi. Urfa, ancient Edessa, has always been an important pilgrimage place. The mosque, built around the supposed birthplace of Abraham, according to Islamic tradition, attract many pilgrims. The sacred fish pond, where, according to Muslim tradition, Abraham, who is being tortured and burned by King Nimrod, is saved by God when he turns the fire into water and the coals into the fish, which are still, you can see the water here, and the sacred fish pond, which still has the fish from the rescue of Abraham. In Urfa, there's also a large covered historic bazaar, which is in this area here, which many visitors go shopping. And in this bazaar, many of the Muslim artisans carry on the craftsmanship from their Jewish and Armenian masters. Urfa's citadel, located here, is also nearby, and all of these historic sites are located within a green park full of trees, an ideal place to rest and have tea. Around this park, more recently, large 5-star hotels have been built, and abandoned old Urfa houses have been transformed into restaurants. Both the municipality and local private entrepreneurs are getting ready to welcome more tourists. More tourists from Europe, from the US, also from the Gulf states, from East Asia, and also Eastern tourists that are organized for Istanbul tourists who are inside their air-conditioned buses exploring their exotic East. In 2005, near this historic area of Urfa, mosaics were accidentally discovered in Livache. Libache was formerly, in the 1980s, a shanty town, which emerged from this urban migration from villages to the center of the city of Urfa. This displacement was due to, on the one hand, to the construction of the Atatürk Dam, which displaced many villagers, as well as to the increasing violence in the 80s and 90s between guerrilla fighters, the PKK, and the Turkish army. In the late 1990s, the population of Libache was forcibly moved, and in 2005, work on the city's sewage system, bulldozers hit upon some mosaic forms. Excavations followed in the next 3 years, and a Mosaic Museum is planned to display these mosaics in situ. This is how the mosaics are being displayed now, protected from the weather, until a new Mosaic Museum is built. The Mosaic Museum will be part of a larger archaeopark in Libache, composed not only of the Mosaic Museum, but as well as a new archaeology museum, which, with the objects transferred from the old archaeology museums built in the 1960s again, transferred to this new archaeopark. And as well as an outdoors park displaying other ancient objects. So this seems to be an extension of the historic and touristic part of Urfa, where a lot of money will be in play. And this seemingly lucrative cultural heritage business has even attracted the attention of Prime Minister Erdogan and his government, who has invested an additional 38 million Turkish liras in this very pro-AK Party, pro-government city. So we finally moved to Diyarbakir, which is not located as part of the tourism strategy of Turkey, but which is located just, this is Mardin here, just outside Mardin, where Gap is. This is the location of Diyarbakir. And Diyarbakir is a third city in southeastern Turkey, very close to Gaziantep and Urfa, but which has a strikingly different identity and a very different way to think about cultural heritage. In Diyarbakir, a new museum will also be built. Work is underway to transform its inner castle, or its citadel, inside the city walls into an archaeology museum. The museum will house the finds unearthed at nearby sites in the region threatened by the construction of the Sudan. The citadel will be converted into a space for visitors to contemplate the carefully selected and sanitized representatives of the region's rich archaeology. But the citadel itself also constitutes a site of contested heritage with a violent history. If in the Ottoman period the citadel was used mainly as an administrative center, in the 1990s, at the height of the conflict between the PKK and the Turkish army, the citadel is transformed into the headquarters of the Turkish army. Inside the citadel, the Turkish army also built a prison with torture chambers, and the prison is still visible today. Not only the Turkish army, but the Jitan set up their headquarters there, which is the Jitan, an underground intelligence agency, which like an anti-terror underground agency. In 1999, after the capture of Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, and after the conflict seems to have died down, the citadel is handed over to the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Because it is a classified historic site, for a short while, no excavations were permitted. But more recently, human remains have been found. And there's a large question in Diyarbakir of what these human remains were, if they're coming from the torture chambers, if they're have something to do with the Turkish military being there in the 1990s. But contested heritage here again, but unlike Urfa and unlike Gaziantep, the municipality in Diyarbakir is pro-Kurdish. They are called, as Nicole Watts has written in her book, activists in office. And this pro-Kurdish municipality conceives differently of the city's cultural heritage. It wants to include Kurdish as well as other ethnic and religious groups in the discussions about heritage. In Diyarbakir, the Nevruz, the Kurdish New Year, has become more colorful each spring. Festivals are organized to celebrate Kurdish folklore. Cultural centers where Diyarbakir youth can study Kurdish music, Kurdish dance, Kurdish folklore, have also been opened in the last 10, 15 years. Another tradition has also been revived within the walls of the city. The Dengbesh are professional storytellers. They're usually elderly men and some women who, at a very young age, memorize epic poems. When asked to do so, they can recite this epic poetry in Kurdish at will. And these poems can last hours and hours. The themes of this epic poetry range from the past heroic tales of warriors to the impossible romance of lovers. But these stories are also filled with allusions to more contemporary affairs, and their accounts often take on a larger political dimension. In the early 1960s, this tradition began to be frowned upon and prohibited in Turkey. The Dengbesh at this moment embarked on a long period of imposed silence. Diyarbakir, like Urfa in the 1980s, has known massive urban migration. Villagers in the region, caught in the conflict between PKK and the Turkish army, have flocked to cities like Diyarbakir, looking for safety and jobs. Diyarbakir's population has increased dramatically from 150,000 in the 70s to 1,500,000 today. The internally displaced population have moved to the poorest areas in Diyarbakir, in the outskirts of the city, or in the center within the city walls, where many gecekondus have emerged. Shanty towns. Following this urban migration, many housing, health, education problems also follow. And today, if a feeling of normality has returned to the city, many social issues linger on. In this context of urban migration, in this context of cities growing, the rural tradition of Dengbesh has lost even more ground. Rural exodus has profoundly altered traditional village life, and the Dengbesh, a remnant of village society, does not seem to fit within this modern configuration. In the overpopulated cities, the tradition has almost disappeared. After a 40-year hiatus, however, the ancient tradition has been revived and reinvented with the help of European Union funding. Municipality of Diyarbakir has allocated a refurbished traditional Diyarbakir house to the Dengbesh and created a museum dedicated to storytelling. It opened in 2003. It's situated in the city center, and it's you see a picture of it here. It's constituted of a large courtyard where these Dengbesh, these oral poets, meet, drink tea, and chat. Occasionally, when visitors enter the enclosure, the bards will enthusiastically recite a few verses and perform these stories on demand. So here in this new museum, we are seeing a different kind of cultural heritage being displayed. Oftentimes, as in the case of Turkey, the modern nation stresses concrete evidence, objects that materialize a collective past, which can be shown in museums. This example, however, is a more malleable form of cultural heritage. It is spoken words which constitutes the heritage, which are barely audible among the noise of the urban sprawl. An intangible heritage used for national self-identification within the Turkish nation. So used for Kurdish national identification within the Turkish nation. Deprived of written archives, the Kurdish imagined community clings on to this oral tradition, which represents a link between their past and their present. It is as with the Dengbej if Kurdish collective memory could be safely archived inside their heads. If it doesn't represent a comprehensive national history, it is still a great source of pride for many Kurds. So, I want to conclude my talk now by summarizing some of the points I've made so far. And putting forward some of the paradoxes that I've explained. So the first paradox that I see in Turkish museums is that Turkey, as early as the Ottoman period, has adopted a very Western form, the museum. It's adopted the museum to display its modernity. It uses, throughout its history, it uses museums to participate in something defined by the West. But at the same time, it's also an effort to use museums to reaffirm its Turkishness against the West. Now, museums in Turkey sometimes seem like a failed project. Museums across the country in places like Urfa or Konya, the museums I showed you, are not very attractive and do not attract many Turkish visitors. Oftentimes it is foreign visitors that make up the largest number inside the museums. The most visited museums in Turkey are not really museums. The Mevlana Museum in Konya is the Tomb of Rumi. The Museum of the Tomb of Hacı Bektaş is the most popular pilgrimage place for Alevis in Turkey. And Istanbul's most visited landmark, Hagia Sophia, is a museum that many people visit for its religious associations. The more secular museums will never attract as many visitors as these. Going back to the Gaziantep Mosaic Museum, it's interesting to see how the past and the present are blurred. The irony, however, is that Turkey's development project, responsible for the destruction of Zeugma and other archaeological sites, is also presented as the savior of these sites and of its mosaics. This paradox, however, the modern threatening and at the same time protecting the ancient, is never made explicit to the museum visitor. The museum, in a way, erases the messy political issues associated with dam construction in southeastern Turkey, making the profound changes brought by dams and brought by development projects seem as natural as possible. The Archaeopark in Urfa seems like the perfect example to think about cultural heritage, tourism, and money. Not only has the private sector, the local government, and the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism taken notice, but Prime Minister Erdogan himself has become interested in the economic significance of museums, with his government investing a lot of money. So, in Urfa, not only do we see a change from the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Ottoman period city to to buildings that describe traditional Urfa housing without mentioning the ethnic or religious source. But also there's this, with this transformation, which involves restoring old houses, which involves moving shanty towns to build museums, which involves attracting tourists by opening new restaurants and new hotels. Not only does the 19th century identity of Urfa get erased, but also the local contemporary past, the local, more contemporary present of the city is erased. There is sort of an effect of Disneyification inside Urfa's historic center. And finally, in Diyarbakir, in the new museum, the past will most likely be presented chronologically. Neatly ordered from earliest to latest, eras will follow one another in a continuous display of time. In the Dengbeş house, however, a contrasting temporality prevails. The Dengbeş adopt a distinctive strategy vis-a-vis time. They recite stories by lingering on certain events, improvising shortcuts, adding details now and then, and it's in contrast to the museum's apparent tidiness. The narratives of the Dengbeş are fragmented, interrupted, and sometimes even forgotten. Archaeology museums, on the one hand, present the past through inanimate things, protected behind glass. Objects seem both distant and silent. In the Dengbeş house, the museum pieces talk back, answer questions, and drink tea with you. It is their voices that embody the past. When a Dengbeş recites, he or she engages their whole body to recall hidden memories, sometimes bringing themselves and the spectators to tears. In contrast to a sterile, air-conditioned museum, the Dengbeş house is filled with sounds and emotions. Thank you.
We have some time for questions, if you have some.
Since the Anatolian plateau has been home to about 22 or so ethnic groups over the centuries, over the eons, will these museums highlight each culture, or will it all be quote Turkish?
Yeah, that's exactly the point I'm trying to make.
They will identify Hittites and Urartus.
Yeah, that within the Anatolian Civilization Museum, within ethnography museums in Turkey, there's a selection process that takes place. Certain cultures, certain regions are emphasized, are displayed in museums, but museums do not exhibit all past cultures, all past religions, languages. In this map here, it's interesting to look at it. This is a prediction in 2023 of which cultures are going to, ancient or present, are going to attract more tourists. So it follows many of the Anatolian civilizations by emphasizing Phrygia, the Hittites, the Urartu, Cappadocia. But you know, the complex politics that I explained in southeastern Turkey is just labeled as the faith corridor, whatever that means.
So the Greek artifacts will be identified as Greek, and the Romans as Roman. Is that it?
He just said probably not.
Probably not.
Maybe not. I mean, I think that's what he was just saying. That's the complexity of the question.
I would like to interject here. There's usually no problem to finding Greek and Roman artifacts in Turkey. It's more to do with, if anything, is actually related to the multi-ethnic communities that have, in the past, some kind of have been involved with Turkish politics, then they are shunned. So, for instance, Armenians and contemporary Greeks. So, for instance, Byzantine culture was shunned for a long time in Turkey. But the reason is because they were actually thinking that it was more closer to contemporary Greeks, not necessarily the ancient Greeks or the Romans. So, for instance, even in terms of the Kurds, the reason why the Denkbeş has been actually silenced in most of the places, except for the one case in Diyarbakir, is because they're still the Turkish nation is still trying to kind of argue about this unification narrative that they are trying to impose since the 1930s, since like sort of the beginning of the Turkish Republic. So anything that actually has any kind of a threat to that Turkish unification theory that has started from the 1930s is shunned through the cultural and
Farce. I'm sorry.
In a place like Urfa, where there are multiple communities of tourists that have interests, like Westerners who are interested in the Christian heritage, and Muslims maybe coming from the Arab world that are interested in the Islamic heritage, is there kind of like a segregation of tourist infrastructure, like certain, since it's kind of like a whole industry, like certain parts of the town get built up for Muslims, whereas like certain parts of the town are more oriented for Westerners, or is there kind of like a predominant tourist culture?
Yeah, I haven't noticed touristic ghettos in Urfa. I think tourists come and can enjoy the same places, but the strategy of certain hotels are definitely geared towards a certain type of tourism. So there's this large 5-star hotel called Al Ruha, which is the Arabic name for Urfa, which is at its beginning, it was designed to attract Gulf states money. I don't know. There isn't in Gaziantep. What's interesting is they've adopted a different strategy where they actually have a street that is recognized as an Armenian street. Whether all the houses were inhabited by Armenians in the 19th century, I don't know. But it's a way to express. Gaziantep feels more comfortable expressing its multicultural past than Urfa.
Is there a plan within the cultural division to nationalize these museums in order to fund them, to keep them being maintained, or is it in the regions that maintain them?
Which museums?
Any of these that they plan. Are they? Where are they getting their money in order to go year to year to expand their collections, to hire people? Is it a national? It's all nationalized.
They're state-funded. Yeah.
So it's really integral to their position in terms of the world stage.
In terms of their position, because they're state-funded, so for example...
So it's prevalent to Turkey's position in the world. It has to come into the European Union. That is, to me, so important politically, in order for these museums to maintain themselves. They're not the private people of some of the museums that are in Istanbul. These really are political national museums, as we would term them in the U.S.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money.
In Diyarbakir, for example, the new Archaeology Museum is state-funded, and the state has received a lot of money from private corporations that are building the dam, because many of the objects are going to come from these rescue excavations. At the same time, in Diyarbakir, what's interesting is that the municipality itself, through the help of a foreign actor, the European Union, is able to fund more Kurdish museums, cultural centers, etc. Almost independently from Ankara and the state. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to add a few things. And thank you for your rather comprehensive For one thing, the reason 2023 has been taken as the year of all of these incredible transformations in terms of the museums is that it is a very political act. Erdogan is going to become the president very soon, it seems like. And he will serve a 10-year term. So that will be his, how should I say, his greatest contribution to his country, so to speak. And also there are local museums throughout Turkey. Many of the sites actually have museums in the villages or in nearby areas which are not necessarily supported by the government. They are supported, many of these museums are actually supported by local enterprises as well as individuals and corporations, as you mentioned earlier. So these local museums, I don't know how many more will flourish actually, or will they be part of this great transformation? I'm not sure about that. But I believe that they are very important in terms of tourism, even more so than these big urban museums that will be flourishing, that will be built up. I had one more point. I had one more point in my mind, but I can't think of it now, so please.
No, thank you.
When did the Turkish government decide it was going to preserve these things after centuries of looting these sites? At what point did it decide, hey, maybe we could do something to preserve? I saw a documentary when I was in London, not a documentary, an archaeological tour of Turkey, for instance, and they went to a ruins, and the English man who would put the documentary together said, "What is this site?" And they said, "Oh, it's a site of an ancient culture. We've never deciphered the language. It was blatantly Armenian." Now, if they're not going to talk about their heritage by site, what is the advantage to trying to preserve a culture that didn't contribute anything to the land it conquered? Obviously, I'm biased, you can tell.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I'm serious. I admit I'm biased, but I'm serious. For centuries, they've destroyed culture, Christian, Jewish, wherever they happen to find them. And now suddenly, they're going to absorb all of this as part of Turkish culture, which is an oxymoron if you ever heard one.
Well, so the earliest laws that were passed in the middle of the 19th century to protect cultural heritage were passed by the Antiquities Law of the Ottoman Empire. So there's always been a concern to protect cultural heritage. But of course, what happens, when a law is passed and what happens in reality is very different. And what I was trying to do in this paper is to show the complexity in different places of protecting cultural heritage, especially when this heritage involves very violent histories and very contested past. So in different places across Turkey, the different identities are going to come to the foreground and different steps are going to be taken, and not everything is going to be preserved. And hopefully in the future, we'll see more collaboration among people to